On the morning of 29th of August 1930, an island finally gave up. 36 people walked down to the jetty at Village Bay on Hirta, the main island of St Kilda, 40 miles west of the Outer Hebrides, out in the open Atlantic. In each house, they left a small heap of oats and an open Bible. Then the last St Kildans sailed away from a place their people had held, in one form or another, for 4,000 years. The houses they abandoned are roofless shells today. Look past those houses, though, and the hillside tells a different story. Scattered across the same slopes stand more than 1,000 small stone huts. Many of them are centuries older than the cottages below. A surprising number are still dry inside. No mortar, no cement. Walls you can see daylight through. The sealed modern homes died within a lifetime. The huts full of holes did not. Tonight we take those huts apart. What they were for, how a wall deliberately full of gaps beats the Atlantic, and why the island they fed emptied anyway. Long before anyone wrote the name down, picture the most remote inhabited place in the British Isles. A cluster of volcanic islands and sea stacks so far west that on most days you cannot see any other land at all. The cliffs of Connacher drop nearly 1,400 feet straight into the sea, the highest sea cliffs in Britain. There are no trees. There have never been trees in anyone's living memory. On the neighboring island of Soay lives a breed of small brown sheep, so ancient it has barely changed since the Bronze Age. And over everything, always, the wind. St Kilda is one of the windiest places in Europe. Winter gusts well over 100 miles an hour are simply part of the calendar. The archipelago is not one island but a group. Hirta, the only one that ever held a permanent village. Soay, Borere, and the great sea stacks of Stock Lee and Stock and Armon, rising like broken teeth from the swell. The rock itself is the remnant of an ancient volcano, scoured and steepened by ice and then by the sea. There's almost no shelter except what people built. There's almost no soil except what people made or what the wind allowed to stay. Now try to feed a village there. The soil is a thin skin over rock. Every gale throws salt spray across the whole island, burning whatever crops it lands on. Oats and barley grew badly even in good years. Potatoes later helped a little, but they never solved the problem. The sea around the islands is full of fish, but for most of the year it is also full of swell that will kill you. The islanders owned small open boats and no harbor worth the name. Visitors were always puzzled by how little the St Kildans fished. The islanders were not puzzled. They had done the arithmetic on drowning. The food was not in the ground and not in the water. It was overhead. St Kilda holds the largest seabird colony in the northeast Atlantic. Borere and its two great stacks still carry the biggest northern gannet colony on Earth, roughly 60,000 pairs today. In summer, the cliffs of Hirta fill with fulmars and puffins beyond counting. Guillemots, razorbills, kittiwakes, and great skuas add to the noise and the harvest. When the traveler Martin visited in 1697, he recorded the take for that season, 22,600 gannets. That is not a typo. One village, a few dozen able men, no firearms that mattered, and they brought more than 20,000 large seabirds off some of the most violent rock faces in Europe. They did it barefoot, on ropes of twisted horsehair, climbing at night onto ledges where the birds slept. A St Kildan man was functionally a professional cliff climber who also farmed a little. Boys learned the rock the way other children learned the road to school. A good rope was one of the most valuable objects a family owned, handed down like land, because a family's rope was quite literally its income. Visitors wrote about the islanders' feet the way you might describe a specialized tool. Broad, gripping, shaped by a lifetime on wet stone. The birds were meat. The eggs were food. The fat was lamp oil and medicine. The feathers paid the rent to the landlord's agent across the water. One species even doubled as a lamp. A fulmar carries a stomach full of oil, and the islanders burned it through the winter. Puffin were taken in huge numbers. Gannets were the prize. Every part of the bird had a use, and almost nothing was wasted, because waste on St Kilda was not a moral idea. It was a death sentence in February. The work was organized with a formality that surprised every visitor who saw it. Each morning the men gathered in the village street in a meeting the Victorians nicknamed the St Kilda Parliament. They talked through the day's work until everyone agreed. Which cliff, which crew, whose cattle, whose wall. No chairman, no votes, no hurry. It looks charming in the old photographs. A row of bearded men leaning on the wall as if they had all the time in the world. It was actually load-bearing government. On rock like that, in weather like that, an argument left unsettled could put the wrong man on the wrong rope. Consensus was a safety system. There was a social order under that calm. Families held strips of land. The landlord for centuries, the MacLeods of Harris and later other owners, took rent in kind. Feathers, oil, cloth, sometimes birds themselves. The minister, when there was one, sat at the center of another kind of authority. Religion on St Kilda was not a Sunday decoration. It was a way of holding a tiny community together against weather, isolation, and the knowledge that the next boat might not come. But a cliff full of birds in June is worth nothing in January. That was the real problem, and it is a harder problem than climbing. The seabird harvest arrives in a few short windows through spring and summer. Winter on Hirta lasts most of the year, and no boat might call for months. Everything the island would eat in the dark had to be caught in the light, and then somehow kept. Kept how, though? The two normal answers were closed to them. Salting needs salt, and salt came by boat, and the boat came once or twice a year if it came at all. Just how thin that thread was shows in the islanders' emergency postal service. When they urgently needed the mainland, they carved a small wooden boat, sealed a letter inside, tied it to an inflated sheep's bladder, and threw it into the sea, trusting the current to land it in Scotland or Norway. Astonishingly, most of these St Kilda mailboats were eventually found and delivered. That was the supply line: a toy boat, a sheep's bladder, and hope. Smoking, the other answer, needs fuel. An island without a single tree guards its peat like money. A village that burned its fuel-preserving food would freeze in February with a full larder. Every option cost something the island did not have, except one thing. The island had wind in a surplus no place in Britain could match. The same force that burned the crops and forbade the fishing was, if you could harness it, a preservative. Wind pulls moisture out of meat, and dry meat does not rot. The St. Kildans did not fight their worst enemy, they hired it. The tool they built for the job is called a cleat. Two thick, dry stone walls leaning slightly inward, laid up without a drop of mortar. Big, flat slabs across the top for a roof. Over the slabs, a cap of turf and earth growing grass like a small green hill. Inside, a dark chamber about the size of a garden shed. And the whole point of the building is the part that looks like bad workmanship. The walls are deliberately full of gaps. Rain hits the turf cap and runs off. Wind hits the wall and goes straight through, over everything stored inside and out the other side. A cleat is not a shed. It is a dehydrator with no moving parts, powered by an Atlantic gale. Split a bird, hang it or lay it on stones inside, and the wind does the rest. Meat cured this way with little or no salt, kept for months. Visitors who tasted wind-dried fulmar mostly did not ask for seconds. The islanders did not care. The standard they were cooking to was February, not flavor. Eggs went in clean, packed in peat ash, and stayed edible deep into winter. Hay dried in there when the weather refused to make hay outside. Peat turves dried in there too, along with grain, climbing ropes, tools, and lambs in a bad storm. Even the placement of the buildings tells you what they were. Cleats cluster near the village for the goods a household reached for daily, and stand alone out by the cliffs and grazing grounds, so a harvest could be stored where it was won instead of hauled home wet. The islanders had built themselves an artificial cave system tuned to the one resource they had too much of, and they built it at a scale that still stuns the people who survey it. Archaeologists have counted about 1,260 cleats on Hirta alone, with well over 100 more on the outer islands and stacks. There are cleats on ledges partway down cliffs and cleats on the summits of sea stacks that modern climbers rope up to reach. For a village that never held much more than 180 people, that is several huts for every man, woman, and child. Spread across the map, the whole island is a larder. To a stranger coming ashore, the slopes read like the ruins of some vanished crowd, hundreds of little stone beehives climbing the hills above a single short street. But almost none of them were ever homes. They were pantries. And the crowd they were built for had wings. The oldest of these structures sit in a landscape that is itself a record. There are traces of much earlier occupation, field walls, enclosures, the memory of a longer human presence than the last village. 4,000 years is not a slogan. People used these islands, left them, returned, and adapted. The last community was only the final chapter of a very old book. The cleats are the chapter that still has pages you can touch. For centuries, the system simply worked. Then the modern world decided to improve it and accidentally ran the experiment that proves what these huts were. In October 1860, a hurricane-force storm tore through Village Bay, wrecking roofs and flattening the crops. Money was raised on the mainland. Over the next 2 years, the village got a brand new street of 16 modern cottages, straight gabled walls bound with lime mortar and clean zinc roofs, sealed, solid, respectable houses of the kind being built across Victorian Britain, lined up neatly above the bay like a promise that the 19th century had finally arrived. Against them, the old buildings looked like exactly what reformers said they were: dark, smoky, half-buried heaps. This upgrade seemed like an obvious kindness at the time. It carried a flaw nobody could see. It turns out a sealed house on St Kilda is a trap for water. The salt gale stripped and corroded the zinc until the roofs had to be covered over with tarred felt. Rain drove into the mortar joints and stayed there. Inside, warm breath met cold, hard walls and ran down them as condensation. Islanders complained of houses that were colder and damper than the thick old turf and stone black houses they had left, and kept using the old buildings alongside the new. Meanwhile, on the hillside above the new street, huts with no mortar at all stood through the same storms and stayed dry inside. Nobody repaired them into surviving. They survived by design. The building that let the island through its walls beat the building that tried to keep it out. Walk Village Bay today and the verdict is carved in stone. The 1860s cottages stand as roofless shells, except the few that modern conservators have rebuilt. Plenty of cleats, some of them centuries older than the cottages, still carry their turf caps and still shed rain. Where a cap has finally slumped, the hut is slowly going too, because the design was never magic, just correct. But hundreds still hold on an island that has been mostly empty for nearly a century. There is something worth taking personally in that. A crofter with no engineering degree, no drawings, and no budget solved a materials problem that still defeats buildings today, using patience and the stones under his feet. Why does the wall full of holes win? A storm attacks a building with two weapons: pressure and water. When a gust hits a sealed gable, the wall takes the full load, and the suction on the far side pulls at the roof like a hand. When the same gust hits a dry stone wall, part of the wind bleeds through the gaps. The pressure evens out. There is far less for the storm to grip. The cleat fights less, so it breaks less. Water is the slower kill and the more interesting one. A mortared wall is only sealed until its first crack, and on a freezing coast, a crack is a promise. Water gets in, has nowhere to go, freezes, and pries the joint wider every winter. The wall stores its damage. A dry stone wall cannot store damage that way. Rain that blows into it drains straight down and out. The wind dries the core between storms. Every joint can shift a hair and settle again as the ground heaves. One design accumulates its injuries, the other sheds them. The turf cap is doing quieter work of the same kind. A rigid roof gives a gale an edge to grab, and once one sheet or slate lifts the storm, unzips the rest. A living cap of turf has no edges. It adds a settled, dead weight that presses the roof slabs down onto the walls and heals its own small wounds by growing. It even manages water like a modern engineered roof, soaking up a downpour and releasing it slowly instead of sheeting it into the joints. None of this was theory to the builders. It was just what a hut looked like when the failures had been culled for 100 generations. Every cleat standing today is the descendant of huts that fell. That is not a quaint historical footnote. Damp is still the quiet failure mode of British housing. In England alone, government surveys have put hundreds of thousands of homes with a damp problem, and moisture trapped inside sealed walls is a major reason new houses need serious repair within decades. The cleat builders never wrote down a theory of moisture. They just never built a place for water to hide. There is another lesson in the scale. The islanders did not build one clever hut and stop. They built a landscape of them. Storage was not an afterthought. It was the architecture of survival. If the harvest was seasonal and the winter was long, then the island itself had to become a warehouse. The village street was only the visible face. The real settlement was the hillside, the cliff edge, the stack, the little dark rooms that kept June alive until March. And here's where honesty matters, because this channel does not sell nostalgia. The system these huts served was as hard as the stone. The men paid for the bird harvest in falls, and the cliffs took lives, right through the island's history. A slip on wet rock, a rope that failed, a ledge that broke. These were not rare accidents at the edge of an otherwise gentle life. They were the price of dinner. Worse was waiting in the cradle. Through the middle of the 1800s, St Kilda suffered the horror the islanders called the 8-day sickness. Newborn after newborn died of infant tetanus in the first 2 weeks of life. In some decades, most of the babies born on the island. The likeliest cause was infection of the umbilical cord, possibly from the Fulmer oil dressing used at births. It only ended when a trained nurse changed the practice late in the century. The huts could keep meat alive through winter. They could not do the same for children. The island had always lived one bad season from the edge, and it knew it. In 1727, smallpox came ashore in the clothes of an islander who had died of it on the mainland and burned through the village. When it was over, only a few adults and a scatter of children were left alive on Hirta. The strangest part is who survived best. A work party of 3 men and 8 boys had been landed on the bare rock of Stocken Armon to harvest gannets just before the outbreak. With the village too sick to fetch them, they were marooned out there for 9 months, living in the stone shelters on the stack on the birds and rainwater. The pestilence never reached them. On St Kilda, even quarantine was made of dry stone. After that, the story tightens like a rope. In 1852, 36 islanders, a third of the population, emigrated for Australia, and around half of them died of disease on the way. Steamers began calling in the 1870s with tourists, cash, and infections the islanders had no defenses against. Money changed what the island wanted. A young St. Kildan who saw shops, regular work, and a world that did not depend on a rope and a cliff had a harder time coming home. The old economy still functioned, but the meaning of staying had changed. Tourists wanted a spectacle: the remotest people in Britain, the cliff men, the strange diet, the parliament and the street. The islanders sold souvenirs, posed, performed a version of themselves. That is not a condemnation. It is what happens when a subsistence world meets a cash world, and the cash world arrives on a steamer with a camera. Contact brought medicine and mail. It also brought measles, influenza, and a growing sense that the future was somewhere else. The First World War made that feeling concrete. A naval wireless station was established. There was daily contact and there were wages. It also brought the only battle in the island's 4,000 years. One morning in May 1918, a German submarine surfaced in Village Bay and shelled the wireless station, throwing dozens of rounds into a village that had never seen a weapon bigger than a fowling piece. Buildings were smashed. A lamb was reported among the casualties. Not one human being was killed. Even the Kaiser's navy, it turned out, could not do much to a settlement made mostly of stacked stone. Then the war ended. The navy left. And the silence afterward was a new kind of loud. The men who had known regular contact and regular pay now faced the old isolation again. Only now they knew what they were missing. The influenza of 1906 killed 4 of the remaining men. Harvests failed. The population had been falling for decades. By 1930, there were 36 people left, not enough young backs to work the cliffs, and the islanders themselves petitioned the government to take them off. This is the part that is easy to romanticize and important not to. The last St. Kildans did not leave because they had forgotten how to live. They left because the arithmetic no longer worked. Too few climbers, too many widows and children, too much dependence on a world that now arrived by steamer and then went away again. The petition was an act of realism, not of surrender in the theatrical sense. They asked to be taken to a place where the young could work and the old could be cared for. Which brings us back to that August morning, the oats and the open Bibles. The oats were a gesture of hospitality for anyone who might come after, or a last offering to the houses themselves. The open Bibles were a farewell in the only language that had framed their lives as completely as the wind. Then they boarded. The island did not sink. It simply lost the one thing it could not store in a clayet: a working community. And one last dry irony. The government found mainland work for several of the St. Kildan men in forestry, planting trees. They came from an island that had none. Somebody in an office decided that was a natural fit. Some of the evacuees struggled, some adapted. All of them carried the island with them in ways no official plan could measure. St. Kilda did not end because the last boat left. It changed form. It became memory, archive, ruin, and argument. Today, St. Kilda belongs to the National Trust for Scotland and holds a distinction almost nothing on Earth holds: UNESCO World Heritage status for both its nature and its human story. That dual listing matters. The birds are still there in numbers that make the old harvest believable. The Soay sheep run wild now, and in bad weather they shelter where the food once did, inside the cleats. Work parties sail out each summer to reset stones and mend turf caps. The houses needed people, and the people are gone. The Cleats only ever needed the wind, and the wind has never once failed to arrive. Conservation here is not about freezing a postcard. It is about keeping a dry stone craft alive in the only laboratory that ever proved it at this scale. Masons and volunteers still learn what the islanders knew without writing it down. Which stone sits, which one sheds, how a turf cap should sit, how a gap is not a defect if it is the right kind of gap. The village street is a monument to a failed improvement. The hillside is a monument to a solution that never needed to be improved. There is a temptation to treat St. Kilda as a parable, against modernity, against sealed houses, against leaving. That would be too tidy. The islanders used every modern thing that actually helped them. They also kept every old thing that still worked. The tragedy is not that they left. The tragedy is that the last generation had to choose between a dying system and a mainland that did not quite know what to do with them. The lesson in the huts is narrower and more useful. When the problem is wind, salt, rain, and time, the clever building is not always the tightest one. Sometimes the clever building is the one that lets the enemy through on purpose and takes away its power to stay. The huts are still doing their job. There is just no one left to feed.